First up, we're going to have Scott Goldstein. Scott's the Policy Director for Transportation for America, an alliance of elected business and civic leaders from communities across the country united to ensure that states and the federal government step up to invest in smart, homegrown, locally driven transportation solutions. You know, I think I had a hand in writing that copy way back when I worked for SGA. Scott previously worked for the Washington Metropolitan Area Transportation Authority, WMATA, and on Capitol Hill for Representatives Hank Johnson of Georgia and David Scott of Georgia. Scott is going to give us a sort of the national overview. He'll be followed by Denny Zane, and I think I'll introduce each at greater length as I come through. But Denny is the Executive Director of Move LA. Zach Accardi is the Transportation Advisor at the Natural Resources Defense Council, and I introduce him more later on. And Christina Barker is a co-founder of All for Transportation down in Tampa. All right, let's Scott, I'm going to give you the floor, and we'll cycle through these about 10-minute presentations for each, and then take questions, have a question and answer session at the end of that. Scott.
Thank you, David. Hello, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to walk through a couple of slides that I've got, and then look forward to everybody's questions at the end. So, waiting for those to load. Hopefully everybody can see the slides. You've already seen the About Us, so I'm going to just briefly remind you all we're an alliance of elected business and civic leaders. We do policy, advocacy, and technical assistance work nationwide in an effort to create a transportation system that moves people safely, affordably to jobs and services by multiple means of travel. So we're here to talk about an overview of what's happening on the federal level with transportation, and what you should be seeing on your screen right now are a couple of headlines from the last week. You see that basically there's a lot of disagreement about what to do next on a stimulus bill in general, and some of the big issues, whether or not to bail out state and local governments. And then you see in the center there, you see Majority Leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, explicitly said that infrastructure will not be a piece of a future recovery bill. And I'll just remind folks, it's not there on the screen, but a month ago, Speaker Pelosi held a press conference, and infrastructure was the cornerstone of her plan to deal with the current crisis that we're in. But fast forward to today, about a month later, and you don't hear the House Democrats discussing infrastructure either. So I tell you all that to say that things are changing rapidly. It certainly at this moment looks like infrastructure may not be included, but you know, we may have a different conversation tomorrow as things develop. But I want to also remind folks that as part of the comment that things are changing rapidly, that engagement from folks like you all who are participating today really does make a difference. And when we're talking about funding for transportation, we should remember that when this crisis started, there was a lot of concern, and remains a lot of concern, that public transit would suffer. If we look back at the last recession, Congress decided not to provide transit with the operating funding that it needed, which meant that local government sources of funding disappeared. They did not provide support to continue operating service, and service was cut back. And it took, you know, frankly, in some cases, a decade to restore lost bus and rail service around the country. So when this recession started and this crisis started, there was a significant concern that that might happen again. And so you see on March 19th, Congress released a bill, really was the Senate Republicans released a bill to deal with the crisis and provide a economic stimulus. And it did not include any funding for transit. And fast forward 6 days later, look down at the bottom, March 25th, that was when the CARES Act was approved. And that had $25 billion in emergency operating support, not capital, but operating support for public transit. In between, you had a couple of different bills introduced to get us eventually to $25 billion. But what really happened was advocates went to work, and the phones on Capitol Hill are, phones in quotes, because a lot of staff and members at that point were working remotely. But emails, everything was ringing off the hook on Capitol Hill, because advocates for public transit were really making their voice heard. And you just see in front a screenshot of a letter that we sent, had 248 signers from all over the country, businesses, civic leaders, elected officials, telling Congress they had to provide emergency support for public transit. And that doesn't even include the thousands of phone calls that I know we generated and the American Public Transit Association generated, many others generated. So that is what made the difference. That's how we went from no operating funding 10 years ago, no operating funding on March 19th, to $25 billion in operating funding on March 25th. I already mentioned, you see there on the slide, just a reminder that Congress did not support transit in the Great Recession 10 years ago, and we know what the results of that were. So as we think about the next steps in recovery, we would just want to share with the group that there's some lessons that we can learn from the previous recession and the recovery effort. Not only was there an obvious need to provide operating support, but there's a need to really rethink how we invest in surface transportation in general. When it comes to creating jobs, not every project is equal. So if you look at roadway maintenance, creates 16% more jobs per dollar compared to roadway expansion. And when we look at the American Recovery Act funds, every American Recovery Act dollar spent on public transportation produced 70% more job hours than every Recovery Act dollar spent on highways. So I share that with you to say that in many states all over the country, if given a blank check, as Congress likes to do when it comes to transportation investments, what they will do is they will spend it on roadway expansion. Those are the projects that too often are top on the list of state DOTs. But as you can see, expansion of roadways is not what's going to have the most jobs per dollar. And it undermines our ability to invest in transit, invest in shared mobility, biking, walking, and those kinds of communities. We also, when we prioritize investing in expansion, we're not investing in maintenance. And so, every state in the country has a maintenance backlog on its road network. There's a virtually, I think it's $99 billion transit state of good repair backlog. And I show you this slide just to show that fixing it first, focusing on maintenance is popular. But when it comes to how we invest in transportation generally and how Congress has chosen in the past to think about transportation in a recovery, it's not required to be spent on maintenance, which, as you saw earlier, has a greater jobs per dollar effect than expansion. And that's not how we do it in general in our federal transportation policy, which I'll talk about in a minute. But I want you to know that this is popular nationwide in communities large and small all over the country. Maintenance is popular on roadways. Maintenance is popular in transit. I don't have this slide in this presentation, but investing in transit is also popular. Again, in urban and suburban and rural communities, investing in transit polls well, it's popular, and has a great jobs per dollar effect. It supports the sort of built environment that makes shared mobility viable, as well as biking and walking and other types of transportation. And so we want to tell you all about that and encourage Congress, obviously, to listen to what the public clearly supports and invest in these types of transportation policies. So a little bit more about lessons learned from the 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. As I said earlier, when it comes to creating jobs, some classes of transportation projects do better on that than others. And so we would argue that to create more jobs per dollar, we have to invest in transit and we have to invest in maintenance. Again, as I said earlier, public transit spending creates jobs the fastest. And so we would encourage Congress to continue to invest in public transportation. Operating expenses, which are critical because public transit ridership is down, state and local revenue sources that support transit are down. And so the operating is on the chopping block, but that is essentially all salary. And so those funds that for operating are extraordinarily stimulative in terms of the economy. And I won't talk about all of these, but I'll just call your attention to lesson 5, which is that in the Recovery Act and in our federal transportation policy in general, the overwhelming amount of funding was for highways, and roughly 20% is for transit and 80% is for highways. There's no reason to stick with that dynamic anymore. That was a paradigm that was created in 1982 when a deal was struck to raise the gas tax and provide 1 cent of that increase to transit and the rest of it to roadways, under the idea that drivers were paying the gas tax and it should support roadways. But increasingly, federal transportation dollars are borrowed or they're just coming straight from the general fund. They're not coming from the highway trust fund or the gas tax. And so whether or not that policy made sense in 1982, which was the year I was born, it doesn't make sense today, and it certainly should not apply, we think, to borrowed money. So when it comes to any future Recovery Act or any future fundamental transportation policy, we would encourage folks to think about telling Congress that they need to prioritize transit and invest in transit appropriately. And 80% of the funding should not go to highways. We should rethink that dynamic. I won't go through all these. I would just call your attention. We have some recommendations for public transit and transportation policy in general in a Recovery Act. But we also have detailed recommendations on a number of other issues that folks might be interested in, and you can see the link there. Just a few more things, because I was talking about the recovery process and the economic stimulus process, but I want to just close about talking about underlying transportation policy. That process is also underway to write the next 5-year law that will set our fundamental transportation policy. The current law, which is the FAST Act that folks might be familiar with, expires at the end of this fiscal year. And the committees in the House and Senate that have jurisdiction over that are writing a bill right now to set the next 5 years of policy. And so while a lot of the attention is on the economic stimulus, we can't lose focus on the fundamentals that underlie our transportation program at the federal level. And we would argue that we have not just a funding problem, but we have a policy problem. And we have to focus on the policy. I mentioned to you earlier that maintenance has a higher jobs per dollar than expansion. But leaving aside the recovery effort and the need to create jobs and stimulate the economy, there's just a fundamental need to maintain our roads and our bridges. And we've seen, our research shows that given a blank check, again, as Congress likes to do when it comes to roadways, states do not invest in maintenance. What they do instead is they build new capacity. And so there's virtually no federal requirement that you prioritize maintenance. And our first principle when it comes to fundamental underlying transportation policy is that we need to prioritize maintenance in our roadway system. And in our transit system, it's woefully underfunded. And as we talked about with that 80-20 split, we need to rethink how we fund roads and transit. And we need to provide enough funding so that transit systems can actually reach a state of good repair. And here's an example of how we get to the maintenance crisis on our roadway network. Too many ribbon cuttings and too little maintenance. Our second principle, we only have 3, so this presentation is coming to an end soon. Our second principle is to design for safety over speed. When we talk about shared mobility, when we talk about biking, scooters, when we talk about taking transit, when we talk about being a pedestrian, which frankly is how every trip, whether a car trip, a transit trip, a biker, or scooter trip, all these trips start as being a pedestrian. And being a pedestrian in America is increasingly dangerous because our roadways, which are ever expanding, are generally speaking designed for cars and high-speed car travel and for very few other uses. So we would argue that the federal program needs to require states to design for safety over speed. And instead of just providing guidance and saying this would be a nice thing to do, the federal program needs to require that. And here's an example of what we mean when we say design for safety over speed. This is all too common in communities of all sizes around the country. That should not be the case. Kids going to school, waiting for the bus should have a safe place to wait. Somebody riding their bike should have a safe way to get around. As I said, this is all too common around our country. And this just kind of illustrates what the prevailing attitude is in state DOTs when it comes to how we invest. You can see just kind of bulldoze what makes a city viable to make room for more cars and reduce congestion. And that undermines all of our shared mobility, frankly, our climate goals, but certainly our transit systems and everything else. So designing for safety over speed, we think would help to change that paradigm. But when it comes to changing the paradigm, and this is our last slide, we would argue that we need to have a federal requirement that our transportation system be designed and measured according to how well it connects people to jobs and services. And the same focus on car speed that makes our communities increasingly unsafe to be a pedestrian or a cyclist or a transit rider also makes our communities increasingly reliant on cars. And if you cannot access a car, cannot afford to drive, or simply just don't want to sit in traffic, this can be a challenge. But there's a way to measure success instead of how fast do cars move, but to focus on how well is your community providing you access to jobs and services. And in doing that, we can value a pedestrian trip, we can measure that trip, we can put a value on it, and we can require investments there in a way that we just don't do now. Same thing for transit, same thing for cycling, et cetera. And so, we think that would be just a phenomenal change in our system that would provide the sort of foundation for the types of investments that I think we all support. I was talking a bit about public transit, and I just want to kind of close with some things that not only transit agencies, but individuals and advocates can do. We can track and publicize how well the current crisis is impacting our community. I should mention that we know that the $25 billion provided by Congress is far from enough. We know we have a state of good repair backlog. We know we have a crisis in terms of personal protective equipment for transit riders, as well as transit operators and maintenance and cleaning staff. So we can track the impact on agencies. We can share that impact with the news media. We can engage colleagues, whether they're advocates, whether they're public officials, if you're an elected official. Tell the story, get the word out there. Advocates and agencies need to be working together to tell that story because funding is being cut back. States and local communities and the federal government are making hard choices, and we need to make sure that transit is preserved as we're making those choices. So in order to continue supporting transit, some ideas that we have that we're going to be working on and look forward to working with everybody on, providing additional operating funding in this crisis, making transit safe with personal protective equipment, allocating resources where there's the greatest need and not along this 80-20 split that's governed investments previously, supporting policies for healthy recovery that you can see, at least our recommendations at that link right there, and then demanding fundamental reform in the underlying transportation program as we discussed. My last slide right here. If anybody has any stories to tell or to share about experience as a transit worker or a transit rider, we are going to be sharing those to make the case that we need to keep supporting this essential service, and we would love to hear from you. So with that, I say thank you and look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Great. Thanks for that, Scott. Next up, we're going to hear from Denny Zane. I first met Denny back about 2007 or 8 when I was at Smart Growth America and we were putting Transportation for America together. At that time, Denny had just created Move LA to bring together business, labor, and environmental leaders and organizations with the goal of raising significant new funding for LA County's transit system. That coalition led the campaign for Measure R, a sales tax that funded an enormous amount of rail and other transit in the region. And it was a powerful force. And Denny was the powerful force that helped to get that going. And LA is now on an ambitious build out of its transportation system. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about the next phase and the broadening of that effort. We're pleased to have you, Denny. Don't forget to unmute yourself.
All right. I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Very good. So yes, Measure R, those were the days. By the way, I want to acknowledge Scott for sharing his youthful his date of birth and his youth, 1982. Well, I was born in 1947, and so I'm part of the baby boomer crowd and part of the activist element of that crowd. I've been working on some form of activism really since college, back in the late 60s. And that's 2006 was a crisis moment in LA County where, for reasons we've only since learned, traffic congestion just really hit the skids. It was gridlock. It was serious. And we were pondering for ways to address it. And yes, bright idea, let's create a countywide ballot measure, the sales tax, because we were getting no help from the federal government, as still is the case. And state governments have some difficulty really helping out individual counties. They always then feel like they got to help out every county in like same way. And frankly, they're reluctant to create that much money. So we were in a do-it-yourself kind of moment at that time, and we did it. We put together a coalition. We convinced LA County Metro to go to the ballot, Measure R passed. Half-cent sales tax would generate $40 billion over 30 years. But not to be satisfied, we tried to go back to the ballot in 2012, 4 years later, to extend that 30-year measure to be a 60-year measure, and we did not win. Now, keep in mind, California, these measures require 2/3 vote. So not winning means we got 66.1% of the vote and failed to extend it. But it taught us that we were long been underestimating our electorate. If we could get 66.1% under the circumstances we were then in, we thought there could be a durable electorate at 2/3. And so we then pressed new Mayor Eric Garcetti, who was very receptive, and LA Metro to do another measure in 2016, Measure M. Keep in mind, the Metro Board, except for 2 members, was a completely different body. There were 11 out of 13 were new members, new mayors, new council members in Los Angeles. Nevertheless, they also went forward in 2016 with another half-cent sales tax, and this measure had no sunset, and it modified Measure R to have no sunset, and it passed. It got, in fact, over 70% of the vote that time. And what was really striking at that moment, Measure R was voted on about 2 months after the crash of the Great Recession, and we thought we were dead meat. Indeed, we got over 2/3 vote. In 2016, there were 4 other measures, big money measures on the county ballot, from community colleges, the county itself, personal tax for parks, so on and so forth. And we thought, oh, all these measures are going to shoot each other in the foot. Instead, all got over 70% of the vote. And that gave us in transit $120 billion over the next 40 years. And so we've got a major build out going on, even with COVID. And there's a dramatic drop in sales tax revenue. Nevertheless, there is still money coming through to move projects forward. They're certainly going to have to reschedule Measure M projects in some way. But the fact that we were able to create that kind of revenue with a ballot measure meant we had some predictable durability, reliability in our funding, and all things didn't just come to a halt. Now I'm going to click on my share screen, and hopefully this slideshow I'm going to bring up is going to show you what we hope to do in the future. Let's see if this works. Oops. All right, let's see. Now, what are you able to see, if anything? Did it not? Nothing worked, eh? So I got to see my pretty face. All right, so here's I'll try this again, and then we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, so at the bottom there's a green icon, and I think that should allow you to pick which box on your screen you want to share.
Yes. Something now?
There we go.
All right. Yeah, now I think you just need presenter mode in PowerPoint.
Yes.
Slideshow down there.
That better.
There we go.
Bingo.
All right. The system works. I love this Zoom stuff. How many of you, I want to vote at some point here. How many of you here are watching in your sweatpants? That's so cool. So anyway, this is the next iteration of our effort. We call this Vision 2022. Lesson we learned from our ballot measure successes. By the way, we did a 3rd ballot measure to raise funding for affordable housing and homeless services in LA County. It also passed $350 million a year to help us get people off the streets in Los Angeles County. And it really just started in 2017, so it's in its early stages, but it will be, I think, over time, a profound value to the county as a whole. But now we're looking forward at other larger issues that we haven't been able to address as yet. One, of course, being the regional transit, the regional commuter rail, Metrolink system, a 500-mile system, which is really operated by a joint power authority of 5 counties. But problem is, none of those counties make it a priority, and so it's always woefully underfunded, and the level of operations is far less than it should be for a region of 19 million people. That was one objective. And as we thought about it, our objectives expanded. And now I'm going to walk through this slideshow and show you where we're headed. All right, we thought we'd moved LA. Maybe it's time to move Southern California. As we walk through the analytics of it, it might be just as easy to move California. California has been investing significant resources in fighting climate change. A lot of money into accelerated deployment of zero and near zero emission vehicles, as well as to address things called super pollutants that are actually more powerful climate forcers than even carbon dioxide, things like biomethane and black carbon. But fortunately, they quickly decay by comparison. So we started looking at that objective because, after all, we only had, according to the IPCC report, about 12 years to make a big difference. And we wanted to not find ourselves just twiddling our thumbs as that decade passed. So we started thinking about a measure that could double down on the investments that Sacramento was making in accelerating clean transportation. Mission 1 would be to accelerate to market hundreds of thousands of zero-emission light-duty vehicles, SUVs, pickups. They're about 50% of the greenhouse gases from transportation, and transportation is about 50% of our total greenhouse gases. So that sector is about 25% of our greenhouse gases. But then we also have this problem called super pollutants, and these are things like biomethane, which is from cattle, from wastewater treatment, from landfills, etc. We need to invest in reducing and capturing these super pollutants. It's the only way, I think, I've discovered in reading through this, where we can actually roll back climate change. And that means we have to be able to use this biomethane and the black carbon, reduce it and or use it. Mission 2 would be really, I think, dumping diesel, because most of our 80% of our air pollution is from diesel vehicles, but about 30% of our greenhouse gases come from these vehicles. And we're starting to see both zero and near zero emission medium and heavy duty trucks and equipment. Our view is that near zero is going to be an important part of the long haul truck market, because the creation of the infrastructure for electric trucks could take a while. And meanwhile, we don't want diesel on the road. So we got to create an opportunity for near zero as well. Then there's this regional transit system that I mentioned to you, Metrolink, which is now a diesel powered, underperforming system that takes fortunately a great many cars off the road, because it's not nearly as heavily used by transit dependent. It is more often used by people who are discretionary riders and have cars. We want to turn this into a zero emission, high velocity regional express system. And a lot of members, the majority of the board there wants to do that too, but it needs a core funding source. We also have to enhance local transit, accelerate the local transit, and accelerate local bike and pedestrian infrastructure. The measure we were looking at could do as much as $15 billion for it. All right, so now let me back up and say, initially we were looking at what we thought would be a regional measure in the South Coast Air Quality Management District. That's our air pollution control district that includes 4 counties: LA, Orange, Riverside, and San Bernardino. And we were building a regional coalition, and that was all going very well. But it turns out that you have to get the legislature to agree. They have to authorize a special an election in a special district like this. And the oil company and oil industry and friends just had too much clout in the legislature. They scared away, even in the more progressive California legislature of today, they scared away potential authors, even Democrats that were reluctant to kind of get in the crosshairs of the oil industry and their friends. So we started going, well, now what? And we discovered that it would require just as many, about the same number of signatures on an initiative, qualify a measure for the statewide ballot as it would for the regional ballot. It's just a fluke of the law. 5% for statewide and 10% for regional was what was in the code, and it comes out about 600,000 signatures, but costs the same to qualify a statewide measure as it does a regional measure. Now, a statewide measure would generate twice the resources as a regional measure would, and it would not have to have any kind of legislature approval. You could just go straight to the ballot, and it was a majority vote. No issue about 2/3 versus majority. It'd be a majority vote. And it turned out that when you looked at the history, the voting history of the state versus those 4 counties on tax measures, the state consistently voted 3% better than those 4 counties together. So we had what we looked like, same cost, twice the money, and bigger payoff, and better electoral support, and no vulnerability having to deal with the legislature. That looks like the ticket. So now we're looking to build the coalition for a statewide measure in 2022. Now, will COVID and all of that have an impact? Of course it will. We'll have to examine that, though, in the next year. We think in the California of today that there is the polling, by the way, on the regional measure was 65% yes, and the state consistently was better than the region. So that gave us reason to think that, you know, we would be way in the 60s if on a statewide poll and only need a majority. That's good reason for confidence, and that's what we're working toward. Now, I know this looks really big, but part of the message of our successes in LA County was that fortune favors the bold. Sometimes it's easier to do the big stuff than it is to do the small stuff. And the reason, in part, is because larger ambitions can inspire and mobilize greater voter support than, I think there are measures around the country that try to put together transportation measures. And instead of having several major projects, had a long list of small projects and lost. Voters want to see solutions, not just improvements if they can. And so we think in the California of today that a measure that can say we will make dramatic reductions in greenhouse gases, we will truly solve our pollution problem, and potentially create statewide network high velocity, zero emission express. Some people call it high speed rail. Well, we'll see. That might be possible too. San Diego, Southern California, the Bay Area, and now the Central Valley are all looking at being the beneficiary of that kind of investment. So I'll stop there, but my lesson to you is fortune favors the bold. Think big.
Thanks, Danny. Next up, we're going to hear from Zach Accardi. Zach's a transportation advisor at the Natural Resources Defense Council. He's working on the American Cities Climate Challenge. Previously, he has consulted on transportation and climate change policy for a variety of organizations, including Transit Center, for whom he authored the recently released Derailed, a case study of Nashville's 2018 transit funding ballot measure. He's going to share some of his findings from that work today. Welcome, Zach.
Great, thanks, David. Can you see my screen? Just go into presentation mode now.
Yeah.
Thanks, David. Thanks to everyone on the panel. Thank you to the Shared Use Mobility Center for having me and having all of us today. And thanks to Transit Center, who, as David mentioned, commissioned the report I'm going to be talking to you about today, which I worked on as an independent consultant while I was living in Nashville. I now work at the Natural Resources Defense Council, and I'm based in LA. Transit Center, I should mention, is a civic philanthropy. They work to make public transit work better in cities in ways that make those cities more just and sustainable. And I think that this ballot measure in Nashville, which in contrast to Denny's work in LA was not successful, is worth looking at for a few different reasons. The first is that these local funding measures are really a crucial vehicle for transit investment, and in particular in more conservative states where other funding sources might be less readily accessible. This specific project has also received, I'd say, overly simplistic coverage that kind of masks the really valuable lessons here. Some of that coverage is focused on the role of the Koch brothers, who I will not be talking about, but can answer questions about. And then on Mayor Berry's kind of high-profile affair, which unfolded during the campaign. I think neither of those are really the dominant reasons why this campaign failed, and also neither of them offer very useful lessons for other campaigns. So really briefly, this work draws on interviews that I conducted, again, while I was in Nashville with a pretty wide array of local stakeholders. It's worth providing a little bit of context, but I'll save most of the time to talking about the lessons. There was a failed kind of bus rapid transit project in the mid-2000s that ultimately got shelved. Kind of out of the ashes of that failed planning initiative came a long-range planning process called N-Motion. N-Motion was a countywide and also regional long-range planning process. The resulting plan was adopted in late 2016. And then the kind of main story that I'll be talking about happened between early 2017 and 2018, during which time state passed enabling legislation allowing Nashville and other cities to go to the ballot to raise funding for transit projects specifically. And then the actual election itself was held in May 2018. So all of the planning, all of the strategic work, all of the stakeholder engagement happened within that 1 year time period. So what was the plan itself? It included 5 light rail corridors, several more rapid bus corridors, a major tunnel to carry all of this through downtown Nashville, a variety of other network improvements, including increased bus frequencies throughout the network, all to the tune of a little more than $5 billion or close to $9 billion, depending on how you count. That money would have been raised primarily through a 1-cent sales tax increase, but there were also three other revenue sources that would have been increased at the same time to generate that revenue. And so what went wrong? Why did it fail? And I think that this is really the kind of key high-level takeaway, that this campaign was really built on pretty shaky foundations from the start. And this is what I meant a little bit about the Koch brothers and the mayor scandal being a little bit of a distraction. And I think this starts with the mayor's office's planning process, which really was led by a group of pretty homogenous kind of political elites in Nashville, people who are close advisors to the mayor, and the kind of package of investments that they arrived on really didn't reflect the goals that they communicated to the public when they were talking about the plan. I'll talk more about kind of what I mean by that. But it was also a time where the mayor's office had made a series of decisions that really alienated Black voters, who, as I'll talk a little bit more about, were a really key constituency in this election. And then there was also this really aggressive timeline, which made everything harder for the campaign. And I think that it was admirable that they wanted to work quickly and think big, but they I'd say in this case weren't thoughtful about how they did that. So these are 3 high level lessons that I'll use to structure the bulk of this presentation. Starting with building trust by focusing on inclusive process and designing the kind of portfolio of projects in a ballot measure proposal to achieve the goals that you set out to achieve. And in this case, I think racial equity in particular is an important focus and offers a lot of really important lessons for the industry at large. So I want to go back to the NMotion long-range planning process a little bit, which really was the bedrock for this recommended suite of projects. The 5 light rail lines really mirror the map of NMotion, which will come up on the next slide. And the mayor's office made the kind of strategic decision that the engagement, public engagement that had been done for that long-range planning process was sufficient, and that they didn't need to do additional stakeholder engagement or public outreach in order to inform the package of projects that would be brought to voters. And just to pinpoint kind of why this was a problematic decision, about 9% of the people who engaged in that NMotion process were Black, compared to close to 30% of Nashville residents as a whole, and almost 50% of people who ride transit in Nashville. So this is a huge blind spot in that planning process, and the outcomes of that process, I think, are reflective of that. And it's really important when you're thinking about planning a ballot measure to make sure you're asking the right question. So the question that NMotion asked as a study was, what should the long-range transit vision be for Nashville and for the Nashville region? And that's a very different question from questions like, what are the most immediate priorities for this community? What are the most immediate needs that really resonate with people? And that's also a different question from, what are people willing to vote for in order to raise their own taxes? What are people willing to pay for now, and how much are they willing to pay? And I think that the mayor's office really didn't ask those questions. The second kind of big picture lesson is to really make sure that you're clear on what your goals and priorities are, and make sure that those are reflected in the plan that you ultimately propose. Then be prepared to iterate when you might get that wrong. So one place I think this comes up really starkly in this plan is that in that long-range planning process, the NMotion process, the consultants proposed 3 scenarios which elected and appointed officials in Nashville then brought to their constituents to review. Ultimately, scenario 1, which is highlighted in the 3rd row of this table, was selected. That proposal was extremely ambitious and included the $5 billion capital investment through 2040, also included a massive expansion in operations funding for the bus system to the tune of $170 million a year. For reference, the existing operations budget in Nashville is, I think, on the order of 70 million. So this would have more than tripled the transit network in terms of operations funding, a huge improvement in transit access. So the mayor's office then said, we're really going to use the NMotion recommendations as our North Star, but they only applied that, and they only honored that commitment in the capital program budget. And in fact, they accelerated the capital investment program so that it would be done not by 2040, but by 2030. So this is a massive infusion of money into this capital project pipeline, and in particular, these 5 light rail corridors, with a dramatic reduction in the kind of proportionate spending on bus operations. And those operational investments are really the investments that get you those critical improvements to transportation access, funding frequency, increased span of service, et cetera. I mentioned the kind of disconnect in the mayor's office's actions, especially with respect to the African-American community in Nashville. The mayor's office, unrelated to transit, eroded trust in the Black community through a series of decisions, including related to policing, to development on historically relevant sites, and the closure of kind of widely beloved cultural institution in a historically Black neighborhood. And this really created fertile ground for really capable, really strategic opposition to successfully sow seeds of mistrust in the Black community, who would have been key allies and key supporters if they had been cultivated effectively early on. Of course, that builds on the historical legacy of distrust in government that the government has earned over time, and that we really need to be working to reverse. Then finally, the campaign itself, the political campaign, kind of mirrored some of the blind spots from the mayor's office in terms of their process. They had pretty insular decision making, and even the members of their coalition and their campaign consultants weren't really empowered to really lift up voices from communities of color in particular. So lastly is to act with urgency but not haste. Ballot measures are built on trust, and making that decision to not build in time for stakeholder engagement, I think was really fateful for this campaign for the mayor's office. And I think that the outcome of that decision is basically to make everyone kind of along a broad spectrum of support for a campaign less supportive. So people who might have been your most vocal champions are now kind of lukewarm supporters. People who might have been supporters, might have been going out volunteering their time, are kind of neutral and content to sit on the sidelines. And people who might not have been supportive but might have chosen to stay home could be activated more easily into kind of active opponents. So again, there are those three lessons. And I just want to underscore that I think, again, this story is really representative of some of the blind spots, particularly in terms of racial equity, that we have in the industry in general, and which I know a lot of people on this webinar and not just presenters but attendees are working to reverse. And I think that this is a really informative story. And I'll just say briefly, I think that the moment that we're in now really reinforces those lessons, really reinforces the importance of being thoughtful in things like the selection of funding sources. There was a question in the chat around how to think about 2020 ballot measures. And I think that that this is a really challenging moment to bring something like a sales tax, which has a really regressive impacts on voters, and could be a particularly challenging thing to bring into this moment. And for folks who have the opportunity to make different choices now, I think it's worth reflecting on. Who are we putting the burden of paying for transportation systems on? Inclusive engagement is, of course, critical. And I think in the cases where we're deciding not to move forward with fundraising campaigns and public votes now, it's never too early to start focusing on building a kind of broad base of support so that it's available when the right time does come around. So I'll leave it at that and hand it back to David and then Christina to round us out before Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Zach. Yeah, that's a really valuable look into what I think is representative of a lot of places. And Nashville is one of those places that's tradition of, of sort of urban focus and the kind of urban transportation system that larger places typically have. And I think but increasingly they're the kind of place that's a model for those that are going to be looking to do these kinds of ballot measures that we're talking about today, and try to figure out what the urban transportation system of the future is going to look like. Christina Barker is here to wrap things up for us, and she's done some thinking already about the times we're in and how to adapt, and has some thoughts. And she's a co-founder of All for Transportation, which is the citizen-led effort that successfully placed and passed a 2018 transportation referendum in Hillsborough County, which is where Tampa, Florida is. All for Transportation collected more than 77,000 petitions during the 2018 election cycle to add the transportation funding plan to the ballot. She led the subsequent political campaign that passed the measure with nearly 60% approval. Christina, welcome.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate everyone who's watching and all the great panelists here, and I think the discussion so far has been great. I'm gonna share my screen here. Hopefully this works. Okay. All right. Yeah, so, I'm going to talk a little bit about, I think everyone is sort of trying to process what this new environment means for political campaigns generally, but more specifically these transportation referendums, and how we're going to look at being successful in the future. But particularly, I'm going to talk about if you're considering a referendum in 2020, and why we may be seeing some communities decide that 2020 is not the best year to move forward. So we've seen that in the press, there's been a lot of delays of referendums that were planned for 2020 or for the spring. This is just a snapshot of those. It's not inclusive, but Hillsborough County, Pinellas County, and Orange County, all in Florida, decided to delay 1-cent sales tax referendums. I think San Francisco has pushed to November, and then there are others around the country that are just thinking that in the light of this crisis, this might not be the best time to put a measure like this in front of voters. But there are still a lot of communities moving forward that are non-deterred by this. That's usually my mantra, is that you put it on any ballot that you get the chance to put it on. And there's always another election, so you'll always have another chance to go again. One of the biggest issue for why we may see communities delaying is the economic decline. I think high unemployment and economic uncertainty can be devastating factors for tax initiatives. To Zach's point, sales taxes in particular that people feel very, close to their wallets is going to be something that's hard to overcome. We've seen, we've seen certain pockets of communities be successful during economic declines, but I think in areas like Tampa, Florida, and probably Nashville, where investment in transit is minimal to begin with, and you're trying to prove the value of that dollar, it can be very difficult when people are looking for work or they feel there's some uncertainty around the economy. The second issue is, at this point, campaign logistics. Voter contact is going to be a lot different in this election cycle. Knocking on doors and holding events and gathering petitions is ever so hard when you cannot, really be having face-to-face contact in a lot of communities, or people feel unsafe having face-to-face contact. And hopefully in November, we would hope that things are starting to progress where everyone is able to get out more. But if you need to collect petitions or start building a coalition, I think that the lack of face-to-face, the lack of people being able to gather is going to be a difficult challenge to overcome. The third issue will be fundraising. In my experience, most of the funds for these campaigns come from the business community. And when the business community is losing revenue in all different sectors, in Tampa, our big supporters of ours were the sports teams. There's no sports right now. They're working on and figuring out those issues. But businesses are going to be looking at how they're spending their dollars. They're probably going to be spending less of them on community impact issues like this. And there's going to be a lot of competition. So, we've heard from a lot of our supporters from the business community that, they're looking at, do they give to a campaign like this, or do they provide philanthropic aid to people who have lost their jobs or small businesses that need grants? Programs like that are popping up in communities all over. And so there's going to be a lot of competition for those dollars, more so than if this crisis we weren't in the midst of this crisis. So those three reasons, economic decline, fundraising, how do we campaign post-COVID, I think is going to lead to a lack of political will, which is really what we are seeing here in Florida, that the politicians who had been huge proponents of this, for instance, county mayor in Orlando, who, this was his legacy project, has decided to delay. And if we see big supporters, dedicated supporters looking at delaying, I think that those politicians and elected officials that are maybe a little bit more concerned with supporting these generally, we're going to see follow suit. That's definitely what we're seeing in Florida. I think they're taking into consideration those other factors about if we can really pass these right now. So if you're a community that's not moving forward, and that's something that we have a lot of around where I am, the question becomes, what can we start doing in the meantime? You don't want to sit still until 2022 or 2021. If you're in Florida, we can only go in general elections. So, but whenever your next election is, there's got to be community building and communication going on between now and that election. Going silent until your next election is not going to provide you with any sort of support. You've got to maintain your grassroots and business support. So communicating to people the importance of these type of investments. We talked a little bit and heard a little bit from Scott about the federal aid that might be available, but most of the time you need a local match for that. Not having a local match can mean that your community won't be able to access those federal dollars. Or state dollars. So talking about the importance of that, transportation spending as a stimulus. Again, Scott delved into some numbers about the numbers of jobs that these type of projects create. Getting that message out there to people, I think, will be important, especially to your community stakeholders and elected officials, that they can be looking at transit and transportation as a stimulus for their community, and starting those conversations now. Delaying is, not an option. People easily forget how important these are. So organizing, I talked a little bit about all that already. Maintain your grassroots and business community support, letting people know that your advocates and your elected officials are not deterred so much that at the next election they will not move forward. Make sure everyone is committing to the next election. Spending the funds you have wisely. So, for instance, there was the transit funding for operations. That's important, but any revenue that you have is probably going to be constrained, and that declining revenue will force some tough choices. I think that keeping in mind that what you decide to cut or spend your money on will set you up for success at the ballot. All your decisions have consequences, whether you're deciding to defer maintenance or you're deciding to cut routes. Those are things that people are going to remember when they vote. And so how do those decisions affect the perspective of your voters and how they view your agencies? And then holding elected officials accountable, getting them to commit publicly that they will go in the next election cycle, that this was a unforeseen circumstance, but that they are not wavering in their support for these efforts generally. If you are a community that's moving forward, and hopefully most people are in this situation, doing some more research. I think having some research post this COVID crisis starting is going to be really important. We have polls in some of the communities in Florida from before the COVID crisis began and after, and we could see very clearly that the support was a lot lower than it was at the beginning. So understanding if you have a problem is really, really important. I would say that investing in additional research now before you determine whether you're going to move forward with the 2020 referendum is critically important. Maintaining your community support. Are you going to have the financial resources? Is the business community still behind you? Is everyone viewing this as the pressing matter that most of us view it as when we're doing these campaigns? Will you have the grassroots support? How will you engage your volunteers in a world where they can't be out collecting petitions or knocking on doors? I think there are some creative ways to do that, but it's something that everyone should be thinking about. Voting by mail. So, some states, some places are considering going all voting by mail. But I think even if you live in a place that's not, you're going to see vote by mail be increased even more than it has over the last few election cycles. And so while you're thinking about your tactics and how to spend your funds that you'll have for the campaign, prioritizing that vote by mail voter is probably going to be increasingly important. And then again, for voter contact, how are you going to digitally organize more phone banking, testing new messages that relate to COVID and relate to the economic downturn, messages like transportation spending as a stimulus, messages like the fact that more people are going to need transit possibly than ever before. I think figuring out which one of those messages are resonating in your communities and using them to your advantage. And on the flip side, recognizing which ones don't. I think that sometimes mistakes that advocates make are that you understand the issue so well and you are so plugged into the issue that messages that are really moving for you might not be the same messages that are moving for your average voter living their day-to-day life and not paying quite as much attention. So that's all I've got. I will stop sharing my screen so we can move on to the questions. Hopefully I can figure that out real quick. There we go. Okay.
Great. So while people submit their questions, and we have one or two that are for each of you. Danny, there was a question for you in particular in the queue. I'll start off with a couple things that are on my mind here as having listened to this discussion. Christina, you made a lot of great points about how to think about the times we're in and what you might need to consider if you're trying to go forward with the ballot measure. One of the things that I'm particularly troubled by, and I mentioned at the beginning I was a little bit pessimistic, is that I'm hearing a lot of opinions expressed that I think present a challenging message situation for those of us who want to advocate for future ballot measures and for transit funding. And some of those are density is increasingly seen as one of the culprits, particularly in New York, of the spread of the disease, and people are a little bit leery of it at the moment. Transit in particular has been seen as a problem, both because people have to be in close proximity and because as an essential service, it's been dangerous for the people who are trying to provide it. How much of that will linger is a question that I have. People are wondering about travel patterns. How long will people be working from home? How many people will shift the habit, even when it's okay to go back to the office, to working from home more often than they did before? Does that take away some of the impetus for transit and the argument for transit, which is generally, whether that's the best reason to do transit, the best argument that typically folks have had is that it's a help for traffic, and it's an alternative for spending your life in traffic. So these message challenges seem to me to be something we really have to give some thought to. And I don't want to put any of you particularly in the spot, but if you have thoughts and want to take on one or two of those questions or amplify my concerns, feel free. I would love to hear from each of you about it.
I'll just briefly say that this crisis has made it clear that transit is an essential service for virtually every community that it serves around this country, large and small. The transit is essential hashtag was trending on Twitter, and that's because it's essential. And ridership is down 90-95% in many cases, but the 5% that's still riding, those are people who don't have another choice. And they may be healthcare workers, they may be sanitation workers, but they have to go to work, and they're often the people who are making the community function. So it's hard for us to imagine a world where transit is not an integral part of the future of our cities anywhere in this country. And then in terms of the working from home and how do we, the future, I would just refer back to the discussion I briefly touched on about our underlying system and whether it's safe and convenient to be a pedestrian and to get around. As we perhaps rethink where we work and how we work, that's going to be an issue. And people have been experiencing their built environment in a very different way at this point. We've seen the open streets movement all over the country. And there's probably going to be a need to ensure that we have communities that are safe and convenient to be a pedestrian, a cyclist, and a shared mobility user in the future.
Danny, don't forget to
Danny,
unmute.
I think you're muted.
I think it's a little too early to tell exactly how this is going to affect both riders and voters. I do think it is true that a large share of the transit ridership in Los Angeles County, and I think many urban environments, are people are transit dependent, and who to access jobs will continue to need to ride transit, and who also perform very, very important services throughout our communities. And so, and frankly, while more people may Zoom or do online work, if we see traffic congestion return, that'll also be an impulse for people to support or use transit. Exactly what the margins are, I think it's difficult to say. I do want to add one thing, though, into the roster of strategic issues, if you will, about ballot measures. Because when I was looking at the national measure, the first thing that struck me was that it was being held in May of 2018, which did not coincide with either a primary election or a general election. And special elections like that then generally get a more conservative electorate. And the same measure might have done quite differently if it had been at either a primary or general election. We always try to go to the November general elections because of the demographics of the electorate. The demographics of the electorate drive potential outcomes. You can win the special election, though, but you have to be very, very strategic in your approach to the campaign. Basically, what you want to do is make sure you know who your supporters are, careful polling, etc., and communicate as much as you can only to them. In other words, don't mobilize your opposition. Generally, in a special election, then you might not want to do television, which everybody sees. You might want to do direct mail or more targeted kind of campaigning. You don't want to mobilize your opposition. But in general, I would say go to the November general elections whenever possible.
I'll add just really briefly, I think that it's easy to get wrapped up in trying to kind of predict the future of what will happen. And I think that I'm trying to bring to my work the orientation of what are the ways in which we can impact policy and funding priorities, spending priorities now that are really going to support as just and sustainable an economic recovery as possible, and really think about how to kind of create the future that we want rather than predicting it.
Yeah, I would say, I have those same concerns about the messaging, especially again in communities that don't have much transit. You do usually get support by saying it's gonna, reduce your commute, reduce traffic. And when there's no traffic, that's a hard message to sell people. But at the same time, I think balanced plans that include a transportation solution for everybody. So pairing transit with those safety, sidewalks, crosswalks, that's always something that I think is adds to being successful. And maintenance, for instance, we heard about what support there is for maintenance. So presenting a balanced plan to people that makes it feel like there's something in there for them, I think can probably overcome those messaging issues.
And that's another piece I wanted to, if we need to end on time, which would be pretty soon here, we went over on our presentations, but we have one question still in the Q&A that's for you, Danny, if you can get to it. I wanted to end on, try to end on a more hopeful note, and that is picking up on something you were just talking about, Christina. What kinds of maybe pilot projects or demonstration projects, or what can we try to advocate for them in this time that might set the stage for something in the future? And what can we be doing now that would help us position ourselves to do something more visionary and ambitious when times look a little bit better?
I can start, and I'll just say, I think people have focused really heavily, and I think rightly, on the slow or open streets project that a lot of cities are advancing. And to that, I'd add, I think there are a couple of really promising conversations. We'll see what the outcomes end up being about really shining a light on hugely capital-intensive highway investments at the state DOT level, and looking at, should we really be spending $7 billion to widen an interstate highway through downtown Austin right now, as opposed to literally anything else that we could spend that money on in the context of coronavirus recovery. Likewise, not to pick on Texas too much, but another major highway project going through downtown Houston, which has already been hugely controversial. Let's reallocate that money to spend it on things that are really going to build healthier cities and facilitate this recovery. And so I think that kind of fiscal responsibility message, I think there might be a window for that I think can really help us bring about some better outcomes.
I would echo that. I think hyper-local investments are what people feel in their day-to-day life the most. Large highway investments most of the time just inconvenience people when they're going on, and that's not a way to encourage spending on transit or transportation. I think that those, complete streets, safety measures, potentially new routes, that's going to be hard with limited funding, but a new route or a dedicated right-of-way pilot project, I think those things go a long way to showing the value of these dollars to people's day-to-day life. So I would say that, if I were advocating for spending to try to set yourself up for success, those hyper-local investments are where I would start.
I think I have a bit of a contrary view, because I think the larger consequential projects attract more support, but it is certainly true that, I mean, for example, the subway down Wilshire would have not gotten votes from Long Beach. So you better be looking to Long Beach with something. So you do need to have significant parts of your jurisdiction getting something clear and important from the measure. So in that sense, local. But I do think, you know, street improvements versus more transformational projects. I would say the transformational projects attract support as long as it's sort of they're directed in a clear way to a geography where people can see that their community is going to benefit.
Anybody else have something to add before we wrap up? Thanks all. This has been really interesting. I could listen to each of you talk more about this for quite some time longer. I think we're done. Thank you so much for being here, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you.